Hi, this is Matt from Rational Pilot. Today we're going to look at how you can use Rational Pilot to uncover hidden trends in your data sets. We're going to be taking a look at a number of the tools, and we're going to be using a data set that represents actually a rather public topic in the Model 3 production data that has come from Bloomberg's Model 3 tracker. This is data that Bloomberg has gleaned from its sources and doesn't necessarily reflect what the company is actually producing, but it's a good proxy. If you haven't seen it before, just Google Bloomberg Model 3 tracker. So with that said, we've started a project in our Rational Pilot system. We've uploaded the data. We used a simple Excel with the date and the weekly production number that we transcribed from the Bloomberg website. So let's start by taking a look at things. So first of all, we can see that there's been a number of gains that have occurred throughout the time series since production has begun on the Model 3. We can see one here, another peak here, and another peak here. These are, for a data science person, these are hard to deal with sometimes because you don't necessarily know if you need to include these peaks or if you need to ignore them. So one of the first things we try to do is try to understand the nature of these peaks. And one good way to do that is with the internal tool. It's an autoregressive capability, and it kind of gives you a speedometer for whether your trend is increasing or decreasing. It kind of helps you see that without so much impact coming from these peaks. Or actually, I should say, it helps you understand whether those peaks are factoring into your growth or whether those are one-time hits. So let's take a look at this. So as you can see, what the internal trend shows is that overall growth is slowing. Now that doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing, but it does imply that the internal rate of growth that is coming from the Model 3 factory is the result of one-time changes to production. And in fact, Tesla's been very vocal about that they have been making changes to their production line. They are using more people, less automation than they thought they needed to, and they've actually announced a number of shutdowns. So before we go any further, let's just save this chart. One of the ways you can do that is by adding a caption to the chart. So we'll just show real quick, internal trend indicates that growth is coming in the form of external step functions rather than an increase in existing activities. All right, so neither good nor bad. It's just simply that step functions are driving this growth. So let's go ahead and label those step functions. So we'll throw those on. So one is that occurred back in February was a factory shutdown. So we'll put shutdown number one. There's actually been three. So we'll put that, I believe it was in the middle of February. I'm not exactly sure of the exact date, but it's kind of immaterial to our demonstration here. So another one occurred in middle April. So we'll put that in. Shutdown number two occurred in middle April. So we're just annotating this chart, and as you can see, each time I add one of these milestones, the chart changes and you get to see where I'm putting things. This is helpful if you have a team that is working on an analysis. As one person learns things about data that's important for the others to know, they can annotate the chart and then it's there for everybody to see it. The other one occurred just before Memorial Day in the US, so we'll put that one in there as well. So you can see each time there has been a drop-off in productivity coming out of the factory, followed by a regaining of that productivity and then going on to the next milestone. So here we can see kind of the step functions that are occurring. So what's next? How are things going to grow from here? So one thing we can do is we can take a look at the increase in these step functions and then make a prediction about what the next step function is going to be based on the slope of the prior step functions. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to come true, but we can take a look. One way we can do that is with the seasonal chart. So when we add that regression in, we can see that the rate of the increase in each successive step function is resulting in a future trend line that gets quite exaggerated in the outer months. But that's simply taking a look at the rate of growth in each step function. So how does this compare to the forecast that they've put out? So we took some liberties and put together what we thought represents their forecast based on their announced Tesla's announced date of June 29th, or end of the month. June 29th happens to be the last Friday of the month of hitting 5,000 cars per week. So one of the things we can do is we can layer on an additional time series that shows the forecast in the context of these trend lines. So we'll go ahead and update that. So this represents the forecast. I'm going to quickly turn off the seasonal chart just so you can kind of see some of these data points here. Coming up here, June 29th, I've got it basically as a linear trend line. This is an interpolated from their statements about the end of the month. And then what I've done is just manually set it at 5,000 for illustration purposes. I'll show you why I did that in a second. But let's just go ahead and put the seasonal chart back on real quick. So we can see here where the seasonal chart indicates that their next step function could in fact coincide with the end of the month. They could get the productivity that they need out of their factory with the most recent shutdown. And it could converge on this end of the month. You can kind of see here where July 6th, according to the seasonal trend line, they would be exactly at, not quite exactly at, but pretty darn close to the stated goal. And then, of course, there's some variability here that occurs after that. So why don't we take a look and set up the chart so that we're just looking at this time period here, right around June. So we'll put in, let's just say 6/30, 2018, and we'll just trim off the edges of that seasonal chart so we can see it a little bit better. So let's put a little caption in here that talks a little bit about what the seasonal trend line is indicating. So seasonal trend indicating that the rate of the next step function from the third factory shutdown should be sufficient to meet company objective. So now you can see where we're going with this, in the sense that when you look at the expectation that we set from the first chart, the internal trend indicates that things are coming from step function. So if you're a product manager, CEO, factory manager, whatever, if you're in charge of setting expectations, it's very important to characterize the type of growth that you're getting. Is it coming from external changes to how you're doing business, or is the current way of doing business accelerating in a way that you're achieving growth? And in this case, what we're clearly seeing with this Model 3 production trend line here is that the evidence is suggesting that it's coming from external changes to how they're doing business, rather than accelerating existing ways of business. So the second chart here, the second caption that we've indicated here is that the step functions are growing at a rate or increasing at a rate that it's reasonable to assume that they're within the range of being able to hit their production target at the end of the month. Now let's take a look a little bit at another way of looking at these trends, and this allows us to combine a couple of different approaches into a unified approach, and it creates a range of outcomes. So let's take a look back at the time before, kind of maybe in between when you had this first step function and the second, first shutdown and the second shutdown. So what we'll do is we'll pick a period like kind of in the early part of April. What we'll do is we'll start our calculations in the early part of April, and we'll look at how these trends have evolved over time. We'll add the forecast to the mix as well so we can see that for added context. So let's update the chart real quick. And so what you can see is that before they had this third shutdown, they were on trend to where if everything went well, if everything went perfectly and all those productivity changes that they made at the second shutdown, they could get pretty darn close to where this forecast was indicating that they needed to be. However, um, we have a number of different ways that we're building our ensemble forecast, what we call our RP ensemble. And so this indicates that there's a range of trends that are occurring within this data up until the point of April 6th. So what that means is that not all the data suggests that they're going to be able to hit this number. In fact, there's a couple of other scenarios that suggest that the timing could slip significantly. And so what we do here is we display it as a high, meaning everything goes absolutely right, a low, everything kind of doesn't go well at all, and then kind of an average of all the methods put together. So if we take a look at the average, where does this cross the forecast line? And remember, I dragged it across, just kept it steady at 5,000, and this helps me see kind of the intersection between the two lines. So we see the end of July. That's not a terrible outcome if you're an average company. If you're Tesla, with the expectations that have been set, that may not be the best outcome for them. Um, Needless to say, I think it if you're trying to predict magic and you miss it by 27 days, 28 days, whatever, depending on 30th, 31st, it's not the end of the world in my book. But I'm also not running Tesla, and I'm not Elon Musk. So in any case, what this chart shows you is a range of outcomes starting with the data that you have up until just before the shutdown number two. And I think that's important because what it's saying is it goes back and looks at some of the historical growth that has occurred, and it happens before these last two step functions have occurred. So this is kind of, I would say, a good indicative picture of how trends are accelerating without looking at the step function being the influence of the step function. So this shows pretty tremendous acceleration. Now, why did they do those shutdown number two and shutdown number three? Well, they probably calculated internally that even though the trend suggested this kind of growth, they probably weren't going to get there. Either the factory was capping out at capacity, or other factors, and they needed to change things. And so while this may indicate that they were, say, for instance, in a good case, right on target, and in a bad case, maybe, this shows September 14th, maybe a couple months of slip, um, they weren't willing to take that risk. And I wouldn't be willing to take this risk either if this is the chart that I was looking at. So another way, as a product manager, as a CEO, as a factory manager, sales manager, anyone who's kind of in charge of setting expectations for the company's performance, you can use these charts to give yourself a measure of risk, to benchmark how you're doing internally, with and limiting the outside influence of one-time events, and these so-called step functions that been talking about in this call. And you can show this is the internal rate of growth that is occurring, the natural organic trend that we see in the company, and the risk that implies for future performance. And so if you're not comfortable with the range of time frames in which to hit your goal, you need to make changes. And in fact, Tesla knew it needed to make change. Maybe they had charts like this, or maybe they just kind of intuitively do. They weren't going to get there without factory shutdown number two and factory shutdown number three. And so in a nutshell, basically what you have is three very quick tools to deal with complex data, particularly data that's got a heavy influence from one-time hits to the data. So very quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to document this. I'm going to show that the RP ensemble indicates a 2.5 month slip, possible slip. Let's say possible slip to objective. Okay, I'm not going to get too crazy with the language there. I'm not the one presenting to the board here, but let's just document it for illustrative purposes. Now, as you get to your team, let me just make sure I put it in the right place. So So a number of the things that we have is we have comments, milestones, captions. We have a number of different ways you can collaborate and annotate these charts. Captions actually have a very unique role in the Rational Pilot system. Um, okay, so we've got three captions here. Every time you make a comment, a milestone, a caption, question, or an answer, anything that you were looking at here in the data is captured. So for instance, if I wanted to go back and take a look at the first chart that we did, I can click the chart link, and there you have the internal trend. If I wanted to go back and take a look at the trend, the most recent seasonal a trend, I can do that as well. If I want to go take a look at all of them, this is kind of where I'm heading here. I can click the Save Charts, and now I have a page that has all of the charts in an enlarged format, along with the caption that we put down, as well as what we were looking at when we put it together. So here in about a couple of minutes, and about the time that it took us to kind of look at this data, analyze it, do a couple of trend lines and captions, we've built a presentation that we could share with others. And very similar to what you would have done manually if you'd done this in Excel or PowerPoint, but hopefully in a faster manner with the Rational Pilot tool. So that's it for today.